He found it in the forest by accident and instantly knew something was wrong. Too strange, too obvious, as if it had been left there on purpose. This is a story about a reality more disturbing than fiction. Watch till the end, subscribe, and write in the comments where you're watching from. The morning began the way most mornings did for him, with routines so ingrained it no longer felt like a choice. The forest was still dark when he stepped out of the ranger station, the air cool enough to cling to his skin through the fabric of his uniform. He paused for a moment on the wooden steps, listening. Normally, this was the hour when the park began to wake in fragments. A bird testing its voice, the rustle of something small moving through underbrush, the soft, irregular rhythm of life resuming after night. That morning, the sounds arrived late, thin and scattered, as if the forest itself were hesitant. He checked his watch, adjusted the strap of his pack, and started down the service trail without hurry. There was no reason to rush. His route for the day was familiar, a loop he had walked so many times he could have followed it blind, guided by memory rather than markers. He liked it that way. Predictability was a comfort. It meant fewer surprises, fewer reports to file, fewer explanations to give later. Years in the park had taught him that most problems came from people, not from nature. Trees fell when they were supposed to. Streams followed gravity. Animals avoided what hurt them. People, on the other hand, left trash, ignored warnings, and wandered where they shouldn't. His job was to keep those things from colliding too badly. Observe, document, report. Do not speculate. Do not interfere beyond your mandate. He had learned those rules early, and they had served him well. The trail dipped gently as it wound eastward, skirting a shallow ravine before climbing again into denser growth. Dew clung to the moss at the edges of the path, darkening the soil where his boots pressed down. He moved with the ease of someone who had spent years navigating uneven ground, eyes scanning without effort, taking in details automatically. Broken branches here meant deer. A narrow indentation there meant runoff after rain. Everything had a place in the quiet logic of the forest. That was why the absence struck him before anything else did. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden silence, no sharp break that made him stop outright. Instead, it crept in gradually, a subtle thinning of sound that took several minutes to register. The birds he expected to hear did not call. The underbrush remained still. Even the insects, which usually made their presence known by sheer persistence, were absent. He slowed without realizing it, his steps becoming measured, deliberate. He stopped near a cluster of young pines and listened again. The air felt heavier here, cooler, as if the sunlight filtering through the canopy had lost some of its strength. He waited, giving the forest time to correct itself, to fill the space with noise the way it always did. It didn't. He checked his surroundings methodically as training dictated. Wind direction, temperature, moisture. Nothing unusual. No sign of a recent storm, no evidence of fire, no obvious disturbance that would drive wildlife away. The ground was intact, the vegetation unbroken, and yet the silence remained, confined to a rough patch no larger than a few hundred yards. He made a note in his pocket notebook, brief and unemotional, and continued forward. It would be easy to dismiss the sensation as coincidence, a temporary lull. The forest did not operate on schedules meant for human comfort, but as he moved deeper into the quiet zone, the feeling sharpened. This wasn't a general absence. It was localized, contained, as though something had pressed down on the area and pushed life outward. The trail curved slightly, then straightened, opening into a small clearing he didn't remember. That alone was strange. He knew this section well. Clearings didn't appear without reason. Fallen trees, erosion, old maintenance work. There were always explanations. This one looked deliberate, its edges too clean, the vegetation at its perimeter oddly uniform. And then he saw it. The structure rose from the center of the clearing, dominating the space with a presence that was impossible to ignore. It was massive, far larger than anything that could be mistaken for a natural formation, and its shape was wrong in a way that immediately set it apart from the surrounding forest. The branches that made it up were thick, dry, and tightly interwoven, forming a broad, squared mass that stood several feet high and spanned a distance that made him instinctively step back. His first thought was that it was debris, the aftermath of a storm he had somehow missed. That explanation lasted only a second. Storms scattered. They did not arrange. The branches here were selected, layered, pressed together with a care that suggested intention rather than chance. Some were stripped clean of smaller twigs, others snapped at precise angles. Nothing protruded at random, nothing sagged. He approached slowly, circling the structure at a cautious distance. Up close, the scale became even more unsettling. This wasn't something thrown together in a few hours. It would have taken time, effort, and planning. It would have taken people, or at least one person with patience and strength. And it stood openly, without any attempt at concealment, as though it were meant to be seen. He knelt near the edge and examined the ground. The soil beneath the outer rim was darker than the surrounding earth, compacted in places, bare of the moss that carpeted most of the forest floor. He brushed a gloved hand lightly over it and felt a faint resistance, a crust where there should have been softness. The smell was off, not overpowering, but noticeable once he paid attention to it. A dry chemical tang that didn't belong among pine and damp leaves. He stood again and scanned the clearing. No tracks stood out clearly, but that in itself was telling. The ground had been disturbed too evenly. The marks softened and smoothed as if someone had taken care to erase what they left behind. His gaze moved to the structure itself, following the pattern of the branches upward. There were gaps, narrow spaces where something small might have been passed through, but nothing like the interior of a nest. This was not built for animals. It was built for a purpose he couldn't yet name. A fragment of pale material caught his eye near the base. He crouched and leaned closer, careful not to touch it. It was a strip of plastic, weathered and brittle, partially buried beneath the lowest layer of branches. It didn't look like trash that had blown in from elsewhere. It looked placed, caught, and held by the structure itself. He straightened and took out his phone, documenting the scene from several angles. He measured distances with his steps, estimating dimensions out of habit. Each image reinforced the same conclusion. This was deliberate, and more troubling still, it was obvious. Whoever built this had not tried to hide it. In a forest where concealment was easy, they had chosen visibility. He stepped back to the edge of the clearing and looked around again, widening his focus. The absence of wildlife made more sense now, though it raised questions he didn't like. Animals avoided danger with an instinct humans often ignored. If they weren't here, it was because something had driven them away, something persistent enough to keep them from returning. He marked the coordinates, took a final set of photographs, and forced himself to breathe evenly. Speculation could wait. His role, at least for now, was simple. Record, report. Let the process handle the rest. As he turned to leave, his eyes caught on something else. Easy to miss if he hadn't already been alert. A mark on the trunk of a nearby tree, faint but fresh. Not a blaze, not a trail sign meant for hikers. Just a shallow, deliberate scoring in the bark, placed at eye level, as though to be noticed only by someone who knew to look for it. He studied it for a moment, then glanced back at the structure one last time. The clearing felt different now, less like an anomaly and more like a message he didn't yet understand. The ease with which he had found it bothered him. This far into the park, nothing of that size should have revealed itself so readily. As he walked away, the silence followed him to the edge of the clearing, then loosened its grip. A bird called somewhere behind him, tentative at first, then answered by another. The forest resumed its rhythm as if nothing had happened. But the image of the structure stayed with him, heavy and unresolved. He knew even then that he would not be able to forget it, and that whatever process he set in motion by reporting it would not unfold as cleanly as procedure promised. Some things, once seen, refused to be reduced to paperwork. He did not sleep well that night. The image of the structure followed him into his dreams, reshaping itself in half-conscious fragments, never quite settling into something his mind could categorize. By the time morning came, he was already awake, sitting at the small desk in his cabin with a mug of coffee gone untouched beside him, reviewing the photographs he had taken the day before. In the cold light of dawn, the branches looked even more deliberate, the angles sharper, the symmetry harder to dismiss. He filed the report early, before the rest of the station fully stirred. He kept his language careful and restrained, exactly as training dictated. Unusual structure, possible human construction, local absence of wildlife, soil discoloration. No immediate threat to visitors, but recommended follow-up. He attached the photographs, the coordinates, and his rough measurements, then sent it up the chain without commentary. The system preferred clarity over concern. He gave it what it wanted. The response came sooner than he expected, but not in the way he had hoped. A short message from his supervisor acknowledged receipt and suggested a secondary inspection later in the week, if time allowed. There was no sense of urgency, no questions asked about the missing wildlife or the material at the base of the structure. The tone was neutral, almost soothing, as if the matter had already been quietly reduced to something manageable. He read the message twice, then set the phone down. It was familiar. Over the years, he had learned that most reports followed the same trajectory. They were noted, categorized, and absorbed into a backlog that only surfaced again if circumstances forced it to. The park was large, resources were limited. Not everything could be a priority. Still, something about this sat wrong with him. He had seen stranger things dismissed before, but rarely so quickly. He tried to remind himself that procedure existed for a reason. A single observation did not constitute a pattern. One structure, however unsettling, did not automatically mean danger. By mid-morning, he was back in the field, returning toward the clearing under the guise of a routine patrol extension. He told himself he was simply gathering additional data to strengthen the report. If there was nothing more to find, that would be that. If there was, he would document it properly and let the system handle it. The forest looked normal as he approached, deceptively so. Birdsong filtered through the trees, and the air carried the familiar scent of damp earth warming under the sun. The silence he had encountered the day before seemed, at first, to have retreated. He slowed as he crossed the invisible boundary into the affected area, watching closely for the signs he now knew to expect. They were still there. The sounds thinned again, subtle but unmistakable once he knew what he was looking for. The clearing came into view, unchanged in its broad shape, but something about it felt different. He stopped short and studied the ground carefully before stepping closer. The outer edges of the clearing had been disturbed, not dramatically, not enough to be obvious at a glance, but enough that the pattern of leaves and soil no longer matched his memory. The surface looked smoothed, as though someone had taken care to blur the marks left behind. He crouched and examined the ground, noting how the lighter soil had been brushed over darker patches, how the transition lines had been softened. Someone had been here after him. The structure itself appeared intact. But as he circled it again, he noticed small changes. A branch that had been angled outward now lay flush against the others. A gap he remembered had been partially closed. These were minor adjustments, the kind that would escape notice, unless one was actively comparing past and present. But to him they were glaring. This was not a static object left to weather on its own. It was being maintained. He straightened and looked around, scanning the tree line. There was no movement, no immediate sign of another presence, but the knowledge lingered. He was not the only one paying attention to this place. Back at the station that afternoon, he requested access to older records for the sector, framing it as routine curiosity prompted by the odd construction. The clerk raised an eyebrow but complied, pulling digital files that stretched back more than a decade. He spent hours scrolling through inspection logs, environmental surveys, and patrol summaries, looking for anything that might align with what he had seen. At first, nothing stood out. The entries were bland, repetitive, filled with the same phrases repeated year after year. Area inspected. No anomalies observed. Wildlife activity within normal parameters. It was only after he began comparing reports side by side that the pattern emerged. The wording was not just similar, it was identical in places, copied and pasted with minimal variation. Entire paragraphs appeared verbatim across multiple years. He leaned back in his chair, frowning. Standardized language was common, but this went beyond efficiency. It suggested a lack of actual observation, a reliance on template over reality. He scrolled further, checking the names attached to the reports. Some were unfamiliar, former staff who had moved on or retired. Others he recognized, and there, buried among them, was his own name. He stared at the screen for a long moment, memory stirring uncomfortably. He remembered those inspections now, or at least the way they had felt at the time. Quick passes through a sector deemed low risk. A glance, a few notes, a signature. Nothing had ever demanded closer attention. Nothing had seemed out of place. He closed the file and opened another. This one related to maintenance and access routes. A note from several years back caught his eye, referencing a temporary adjustment to patrol paths due to terrain concerns. He remembered that too. A discussion in a meeting, a suggestion he himself had made. The area was rough, underused, and far from visitor traffic. Redirecting patrols had seemed practical, even responsible. He had not questioned the request at the time. Why would he have? It fit the logic of efficiency the system prized. The realization settled slowly, heavy and unwelcome. The clearing, the structure, the silence around it, none of it existed in isolation. It was part of something that had been allowed to persist through neglect, through routine, through the quiet accumulation of decisions that no one thought important enough to challenge. He pushed away from the desk and stood, needing distance from the screen. Outside, the afternoon light slanted across the station grounds, and a group of visitors gathered near the information board, laughing as they studied a trail map. The park to them was exactly what it was meant to be: open, safe, and untouched. He returned to his desk and reopened the photographs from the clearing. This time, he looked past the structure itself, focusing instead on the edges of the frame, the tree with the faint mark, the uniform spacing of certain branches, the subtle order imposed on what should have been chaos. It all suggested planning, not improvisation. By evening, he had ruled out the simplest explanations. This was not the work of hunters or campers. It was not an art installation, not in a protected area this remote and with no record of permission. It was not the result of natural forces. Every path he followed led back to the same conclusion. This had been built intentionally by someone who understood the terrain and felt confident enough to leave it exposed. The question that remained was why. He sent a follow-up message to his supervisor, attaching additional notes about the soil condition and the apparent maintenance of the structure. The reply came hours later, brief and carefully worded. It suggested waiting for confirmation from environmental services before drawing conclusions, and reminded him not to overextend resources on a single anomaly. He read the message once, then again. The language was polite, reasonable, and dismissive all at once. There was no denial, but no encouragement either. The issue was being gently pushed back into the realm of later. That night, as darkness settled over the forest, he found himself thinking less about the structure and more about the system that surrounded it, about how easily something could exist in plain sight if everyone assumed someone else had already looked, about how silence, once normalized, became invisible. He knew then that returning to the clearing would not be optional. Whatever this was, it would not reveal itself through reports alone. And the longer it remained unexamined, the more certain he became that it was not meant to be understood quickly. As he prepared for bed, he checked his boots and pack for the next day, movements automatic. Outside, the forest lay quiet under the stars, giving no indication of the complexity hidden beneath its surface. He wondered, not for the first time, how many other places like that clearing existed within the park, unnoticed because no one expected to find anything there. The thought followed him as he turned off the light, a persistent unease that would not be set aside. The structure had been the first sign, but it was already clear to him that it would not be the last. The third day after the discovery began with a decision he had been circling without naming. He did not tell anyone he was changing his route. On paper, his patrol plan remained the same, filed and approved like dozens before it. In practice, he adjusted his course as soon as the trees closed around him, following the faintest deviations in the terrain, paths that existed more in memory and intuition than on any official map. The forest here felt different now, not because it had changed, but because his way of seeing it had. What once registered as background had become signal. He noticed how certain game trails ended abruptly, how fallen branches lay where they should not, how the soil in some places bore a texture inconsistent with erosion or animal movement. None of it was dramatic. Taken alone, each detail could be dismissed. Taken together, they suggested repetition. He found the second structure by accident, or what would have felt like an accident a week earlier. It sat farther downslope, partially obscured by young growth, Smaller than the first, but unmistakably similar in construction. The same deliberate weaving of branches, the same compacted earth beneath, the same absence of surrounding life. This one leaned against a single tree trunk, as though anchored to it, its mass pressed close enough that the bark beneath showed signs of abrasion. He did not approach immediately. Instead, he stood back and surveyed the wider area, forcing himself to slow down. Panic would lead nowhere. Patterns required distance. He circled the site at a wide radius, marking the perimeter mentally, then checked his GPS. When he overlaid the coordinates with those of the first structure, a line formed between them, not straight, but intentional, following the contours of the land rather than cutting across them. By midday, he had located two more. Each varied slightly in size and orientation, but the similarities were too precise to ignore. They were spaced at intervals that made sense only if one considered movement through the forest not as a visitor would, but as someone transporting something heavy, something that needed landmarks rather than concealment. None of the structures were hidden. All were visible once you knew how to look, and each occupied a position that made navigation between them efficient. He sat on a fallen log near the fourth structure and let the realization settle. What he had taken for an anomaly was part of a system. The first structure had felt large because it was the first. In context, it was merely one node among many. He thought back to his years in the park, to the areas he had avoided without ever questioning why. Routes changed for reasons that had seemed reasonable at the time: safety, efficiency, budget constraints. He remembered recommending adjustments himself, drawing lines on maps during meetings, unaware of how those lines intersected with places he had never truly examined. The weight of that knowledge pressed in on him now. He had not built these things. He had not ordered their construction, but he had helped create the conditions that allowed them to exist undisturbed. The realization did not arrive with guilt so much as a cold clarity. Responsibility was rarely dramatic. More often it was procedural. He documented everything, methodically and thoroughly. Photographs from multiple angles, soil samples sealed and labeled, notes taken with care, avoiding interpretation. He wanted evidence that would stand on its own, not observations that could be dismissed as speculation. Still, even as he worked, he understood that the problem was no longer just the structures themselves. It was what they implied. Late in the afternoon, he followed the line formed by the sites farther than he intended, pushed onward by a sense that stopping now would only postpone what was inevitable. The forest thinned slightly, opening into an area that had once been used as a temporary access point decades earlier, long before his time. He remembered it vaguely from old maps, a place where maintenance vehicles had once passed through before the route was deemed unnecessary and allowed to disappear. The ground here was different, harder, less forgiving underfoot. He noticed shallow depressions running parallel to one another, softened by time but still visible beneath the leaf litter. Tire marks too narrow for modern vehicles, but unmistakable once recognized. They led away from the access point and into the deeper forest, aligning with the path formed by the structures. He stood there for a long time, listening to his own breathing, to the distant, tentative sounds of life returning at the edges of the affected area. The system was larger than he had imagined, older too. This was not a recent intrusion. It had been operating quietly, efficiently, for years, perhaps longer, using the park not as a hiding place, but as infrastructure. When he returned to the station that evening, he did not immediately file a report. Instead, he spread his notes across the desk and began cross-referencing them with internal documents, maintenance logs, and archived correspondence. The connections emerged slowly, then all at once. Requests for route changes that coincided with the earliest estimated construction dates. Environmental assessments delayed or canceled without clear explanation. Contractors brought in briefly, then dismissed. None of it pointed to a single villain. That, he realized, was part of what made it effective. Decisions were distributed across departments, justified individually, harmless in isolation. No one person had overseen the whole. No one, perhaps, had wanted to. He drafted a report that night, longer and more detailed than any he had written before. He chose his words carefully, framing the findings not as accusations, but as observations that demanded attention. He attached everything: photographs, coordinates, comparisons to past patrol routes, notes on soil composition, When he finished, he hesitated, cursor blinking at the end of the document. He knew what would happen if he sent it. Best case, it would be buried under review, its urgency softened by committees and cautious language. Worst case, it would trigger a response that treated the symptoms rather than the cause. The system was not designed to confront problems that implicated its own processes. In the end, he sent it anyway. The reply did not come that night nor the next morning. When it did arrive, it was not from his immediate supervisor, but from higher up, and it was measured to the point of sterility. They acknowledged the thoroughness of his work. They agreed that further assessment was warranted. They also advised him, gently but firmly, to limit independent investigation until a formal review could be conducted. He read the message with a growing sense of unease. There was no denial, no outright dismissal. Instead, there was containment, a narrowing of scope, a reminder of boundaries. He closed his email and stared out the window at the forest beyond the station. Somewhere out there, the structures remained, unchanged, waiting. He understood now that the question was no longer whether the system existed. It was whether anyone intended to dismantle it or whether it would simply be managed, reclassified, and allowed to persist under a different name. As evening fell, he made a quiet decision. He would continue to follow the pattern, but carefully. He would observe without drawing attention, document without broadcasting his movements. If the system was as deliberate as it appeared, it would not remain indifferent to scrutiny forever. The forest outside darkened, its vastness settling into shadow. For the first time since he had begun working here, he felt not like a guardian of the land, but like someone standing inside a machine he was only beginning to understand. And the deeper he looked, the clearer it became that this machine had been running smoothly precisely because no one had ever tried to see it whole. The waiting was worse than discovery. After the message from above arrived, carefully neutral and stripped of urgency, the days settled into a tense stillness that felt artificial, as if time itself had been instructed to slow down. Officially, he followed orders. His patrols stayed within approved routes. His reports returned to their usual brevity. On paper, everything resumed its proper shape. In reality, his attention never left the system he had uncovered. He learned quickly how to watch without appearing to watch. Years in the park had taught him that movement drew notice far more than stillness. He adjusted his routines by minutes rather than miles, arriving earlier at some checkpoints, lingering longer at others, letting patterns blur just enough to seem unintentional. He spoke less at the station, listened more. The conversations around him continued as they always had, filled with small complaints, weather observations, budget frustrations. No one mentioned the structures. No one mentioned the report. That silence was not reassuring. It was efficient. He began to understand the logic that governed the response. The problem was not that the system did not recognize what he had found. It was that recognition came with consequences too large to absorb cleanly. Environmental remediation on the scale implied by the network of sites would be costly, disruptive, and impossible to contain within a single department. Admitting the truth would not just expose contamination, it would expose years of oversight failures, procedural shortcuts, and quietly accepted risks. The damage would not be limited to the forest. It would spread outward into agencies, into courts, into public trust. From that perspective, inaction made a certain kind of sense. The park, after all, was still standing. Visitors still arrived. Wildlife thrived just beyond the affected zones. The harm was slow, controlled, geographically contained. To intervene now would be to choose chaos over management. He did not agree with that reasoning, but he could no longer pretend not to see it. One evening, as he reviewed older correspondence at his desk, he found an email thread he barely remembered. It dated back years, to the period when the patrol routes had first been altered. The language was cautious, almost apologetic, citing efficiency and safety concerns, budget realignments, the need to focus resources where they mattered most. His own response sat in the chain, brief and accommodating. He had agreed without hesitation, relieved to reduce coverage in a difficult area that had never seemed to justify the effort. He closed the file slowly. The personal stake crystallized then, not as fear of punishment or loss, but as recognition. He was not an outsider stumbling onto a hidden truth. He was part of the structure that had allowed it to exist. The system did not feel foreign because it had been built in part by people like him, making reasonable decisions in isolation, trusting that someone else was seeing the larger picture. The next development came quietly. A notice circulated internally announcing a scheduled environmental survey in the sector he had flagged, to be conducted by an external contractor. The language framed it as routine, precautionary, nothing out of the ordinary. He read between the lines easily enough. This was not an investigation. It was an assessment designed to define limits, to establish how much could be acknowledged without opening doors that could not be closed. He encountered the survey team 2 days later, their vehicles parked neatly along a service road that had not been used in years. They were professional, polite, and incurious in the way of people who knew exactly what questions not to ask. He watched from a distance as they took samples, marked locations, and packed their equipment with practiced efficiency. They did not approach the structures directly. Instead, they worked around them, careful to maintain a buffer that preserved plausible deniability. That night, he returned to one of the sites alone, moving with the confidence of familiarity. The forest greeted him with its usual quiet, but he sensed a new tension there, not in the land itself, but in his awareness of being observed. He examined the structure carefully, noting subtle changes since his last visit. A marker placed differently, soil disturbed and then smoothed again. The system was responding, adjusting itself to scrutiny. He realized then that exposure was not the greatest threat to what had been built here. Attention was. The structures had been designed to be found eventually, but on terms controlled by those who understood their purpose. Discovery by the wrong person, at the wrong time, introduced variables the system did not tolerate well. The following morning, he was called into a meeting. It was brief, cordial, and meticulously non-confrontational. A regional administrator thanked him for his diligence, acknowledged his concerns, and explained in careful detail the steps being taken to address the situation. There was no mention of wrongdoing, no suggestion of intent. The language centered on optimization, mitigation, long-term planning. He listened without interruption, noting how the explanation framed the forest as a resource to be balanced rather than a responsibility to be defended. When the administrator finished, there was a pause and opening for agreement. He nodded as expected. Leaving the office, he felt an unfamiliar calm. The boundaries were now clear. The system was not ignorant, it was choosing. And by acknowledging his findings while limiting their implications, it had effectively absorbed the threat he posed. At least that was the intention. That afternoon, he returned to his cabin earlier than usual. He sat at the table, surrounded by notes and maps, and considered his options. Continuing to push internally would lead nowhere. He would be managed, reassigned, or quietly sidelined. The structures would remain, perhaps modified, perhaps renamed, but fundamentally intact. He thought again of the scale he had glimpsed, of how small the first structure had seemed once he understood the whole. The forest was not being used as a dumping ground by accident. It was being used because it was stable, predictable, and protected by the very systems meant to preserve it. As dust settled, he packed a small bag with items he might need, not for confrontation, but for documentation. Camera batteries, storage cards, copies of his notes. He did not plan anything reckless. He planned persistence. Systems like this did not collapse under force. They eroded when their logic was exposed, when their efficiency was made visible rather than assumed. Standing outside, he looked out over the darkening trees, the park stretching far beyond what any single person could truly know. For years, he had believed that protecting it meant maintaining order, following procedure, trusting in gradual improvement. Now he understood that sometimes order itself was the problem. He did not know yet what form his next steps would take, only that he could no longer unsee what lay beneath the surface. The forest, silent and immense, offered no guidance. It simply endured, holding the consequences of human decisions in its soil, waiting to see whether anyone would accept the cost of telling the whole truth. As night fell fully, he returned inside and closed the door behind him, aware that whatever he chose to do next would place him outside the comfortable neutrality he had inhabited for so long. The system had shown him its limits. Now he would have to decide whether to accept them or to test how much pressure they could withstand before they began to crack. He did not leave immediately. The decision to step outside the boundaries of the system was not a dramatic break, but a gradual shift, a recalibration of how he moved through the days that followed. Outwardly, nothing changed. He showed up on time, completed his patrols, exchanged the same measured conversations with colleagues. Inwardly, his attention sharpened, narrowing toward the edges of what he was no longer supposed to see. He began working at night. It started innocently enough, framed even to himself as preparation rather than defiance. He revisited the sites after dark, not to interfere, but to observe what daylight concealed. The forest transformed at night, distances collapsing into shadows, sounds carrying farther than they should. He moved slowly, deliberately, keeping to the margins of the structures, careful not to disturb anything that might signal his presence. What he discovered unsettled him more than the structures themselves. There was activity, not constant, not reckless, but regular enough to establish rhythm. On 2 separate nights, he watched distant lights flicker briefly between the trees, never lingering long enough to be easily traced. On another, he found fresh impressions in the soil near one of the sites, shallow but unmistakable, aligned with the same routes he had mapped earlier. Whatever was being moved through the forest had not stopped. The survey teams, the meetings, the neutral language had changed nothing on the ground. He began cross-checking dates, overlaying his observations with internal schedules, maintenance crews, contractor access windows, supply deliveries routed through adjacent regions. The pattern that emerged was subtle but consistent. The forest was being used in the gaps between official oversight, threaded carefully through moments when no single department could be held responsible for what passed through. The more he uncovered, the more he understood the intelligence of the system. It did not rely on secrecy alone. It relied on fragmentation. Each part knew only what it needed to function, and no more. Exposure, when it occurred, was absorbed by procedure, softened by review, reduced to a line item that could be postponed. The pressure began to make itself felt soon after. It arrived not as a threat, but as concern. A conversation with his supervisor about workload balance, a suggestion that he take a few days off, that he seemed tired, distracted, an offer to reassign him temporarily to visitor-facing duties, a move framed as appreciation for his experience. He declined politely, citing routine obligations. The conversation ended amicably, but the message was clear enough. Someone had noticed. He adjusted again, becoming more careful. He limited how much he documented digitally, keeping critical notes offline. He stored backups away from the station, trusting physical distance more than any internal system. Still, the sense of being watched intensified, not in a theatrical way, but in the quiet accumulation of small signals. A gate he remembered locking left open. A vehicle parked where it had no reason to be. Footprints near his cabin that vanished before he could examine them closely. None of it was actionable. All of it was intentional. One evening, as he returned late from a patrol that had taken him farther west than usual, he found an envelope tucked beneath the wiper of his truck. There was no name on it, no seal, just his address written in neat, unhurried script. Inside was a single page, unmarked except for a printed map segment. He recognized it instantly. It showed one of the sites he had documented, highlighted not with a warning, but with a note that read simply, "This area is scheduled for remediation." He sat in the truck for a long time, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. The message was not a denial of what he had found. It was an acknowledgement paired with an instruction. Stand down. Let the process proceed. Accept the version of resolution being offered. He folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the envelope. The system, he realized, was not trying to silence him. It was trying to recruit his compliance by appealing to his sense of order, to his desire for stability. It was offering him a way to step back without admitting defeat. That night, he made his choice. He contacted someone he had not spoken to in years, a former colleague who had left the service after clashing with regional administration over an unrelated issue. They met in a place far from the park, a quiet diner off a state road, chosen precisely because it had nothing to do with forests or policy. He did not explain everything at once. He didn't need to. He shared enough to make the scope clear, enough to show that this was not speculation, but documentation. The response was not outrage nor disbelief. It was recognition. His former colleague understood immediately what was at stake, not just environmentally, but institutionally. They spoke at length about what would happen if the information went public, about the lawsuits, the hearings, the reputations that would collapse. They spoke, too, about what would happen if it didn't, the slow poisoning of land no one lived on, the normalization of sacrifice zones hidden behind preservation rhetoric. When they parted, nothing had been promised. No plan was finalized. But the burden he had been carrying alone had shifted, redistributed into something more manageable. Back in the park, the pressure escalated subtly. His patrol area was reduced. His access to certain records quietly revoked under the guise of administrative restructuring. Still, the system did not move against him openly. It waited, confident that exhaustion and isolation would do the work for it. Instead, he continued, documenting carefully, selectively, feeding information outward in fragments that could not be traced easily back to him. He did not seek spectacle. He sought inevitability. Once enough independent observers held pieces of the same truth, suppression would become inefficient. Inefficiency was the system's highest value. The forest, meanwhile, remained unchanged. The structures stood as they always had, patient and indifferent. Animals skirted their boundaries. The soil beneath them continued to absorb what had been placed there, molecule by molecule. Nothing about the landscape suggested urgency. That, too, was part of the danger. On a cold morning near the end of the week, he returned to the first clearing alone, standing at the edge where his discovery had begun. The structure loomed before him, no longer mysterious, but no less disturbing. He understood now that it had never been meant as a secret. It was a signal, a marker within a language of logistics and cost-benefit analysis written across the land. He placed his hand briefly against the bark of the tree beside it, feeling the rough texture beneath his palm. He thought of all the moments he had passed through this forest without seeing what lay beneath the surface, of all the reports he had signed, the routes he had redirected, the assumptions he had accepted without question. He stepped back and took one final set of photographs, knowing they would not remain private for long. As he turned to leave, the forest around him stirred faintly, a breeze passing through the canopy, leaves shifting in a sound that was almost, but not quite, a whisper. He did not interpret it as approval or warning. Nature, he had learned, did not take sides. It recorded consequences. Whatever came next would not be clean or contained. The system he had exposed would resist, adapt, and attempt to survive. But it had lost its greatest advantage, invisibility. And once something like this was seen clearly enough, it could no longer be treated as an acceptable cost. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time since the discovery, he felt steady. The forest would not thank him. The system would not forgive him. But the truth, once set in motion, would no longer belong to any one person to bury. The first signs of collapse did not come with sirens or headlines. They arrived quietly, folded into ordinary days, disguised as routine adjustments that nevertheless carried an unfamiliar tension. Vehicles appeared along the service roads without markings he recognized. Meetings were scheduled, then canceled, then rescheduled with different attendees. The forest itself remained unchanged, but the human activity around it shifted, tightening like a net being drawn inward. He was no longer excluded. That, more than anything, told him the balance had changed. Requests for clarification began to arrive in his inbox, careful and indirect. Analysts from outside the regional chain asked for historical context, for patrol rationale, for environmental baselines he had helped establish years earlier. The questions were framed as neutral fact-finding, but he recognized the tone. Someone somewhere had decided that containment was no longer cheaper than exposure. He responded selectively, answering what could be corroborated, avoiding speculation, letting the documentation speak for itself. By now, the information no longer flowed in a single direction. Pieces he had released quietly were resurfacing through other channels, cross-referenced, validated, strengthened by independent confirmation. What had once been an internal inconvenience was becoming a shared problem. The system reacted as systems always did when their assumptions failed. It recalculated. Environmental closures were announced, initially described as temporary and precautionary. Access to several remote sectors was restricted, ostensibly for safety reviews. Visitors were rerouted, maps quietly updated. To an outsider, it looked like responsible management. To him, it was triage. He returned to the forest less often now, not because he was forbidden, but because his presence was no longer necessary. Others walked the paths he had traced, measured the sites he had found, took samples from soil he had knelt beside weeks earlier. The structures were photographed, cataloged, and finally acknowledged, though never by that name. They became assemblages, surface indicators, legacy material zones. Language softened their intent, but it could no longer erase their existence. One afternoon, he was asked to brief a small group of officials from outside the Park Service. They listened intently as he spoke, their expressions controlled, professional. No one challenged his account. No one questioned his conclusions. When he finished, there was a brief silence, then a nod from the woman at the head of the table. She thanked him for his persistence. It was not an apology, it was not absolution, but it was recognition, and it carried weight. The consequences began to unfold in layers. Contracts were suspended pending review. Old agreements resurfaced, their language scrutinized under a light they had never faced before. Departments that had once operated in parallel found themselves required to coordinate, their justifications no longer sufficient on their own. The fragmentation that had protected the system became a liability. He watched it happen from a distance, aware that his role was diminishing by design. Systems preferred clean narratives, and he was too entangled, too compromised by proximity. That suited him. He had not done this to become a figurehead. One evening, he returned to the first clearing for what he knew would be the last time. The structure still stood, but it felt different now, diminished not in size but in significance. Flags marked the perimeter. Signs warned of restricted access. The forest around it had not recovered. Whatever had driven wildlife away lingered in the soil, invisible but persistent. He stood there quietly, hands in his pockets, and considered the cost. The land would take years to heal, if it ever fully did. The damage could be mitigated, contained, but not undone. The park would endure, but altered, its history rewritten to include what had been hidden. He did not feel triumph. He felt something closer to resolution. Back at the station, he began the process of leaving. Not formally, not yet, but internally. His work here was finished in a way no reassignment could address. The forest would continue without him, watched now by many eyes instead of few. The system would adapt, as it always did, incorporating this disruption into its evolving logic. On his final day in uniform, he filed one last report. It was brief, factual, and unremarkable. There was nothing left to add. The truth had moved beyond documentation into consequence, where it belonged. As he packed his things, he found the notebook he had carried since the first discovery, its pages filled with careful observations and restrained language. He closed it gently and left it behind, archived among records that would now be read differently than before. Outside, the forest stretched away in the afternoon light, vast and indifferent. He took a deep breath, committing the smell of earth and pine to memory. This place had taught him how easily harm could hide behind good intentions, and how responsibility often arrived too late to feel clean. He walked away without looking back, knowing that the final shape of what he had set in motion would be determined by forces larger than any one person. But he also knew this: the system would never again be able to claim ignorance, and in that knowledge lay the only kind of justice the forest would ever receive. The forest did not notice his absence. That was the first truth he accepted after leaving the station for the last time. His uniform folded neatly in a box he placed in the back of his truck. The gates opened and closed behind him with the same indifferent rhythm they always had, and the road carried him away without resistance. If the land remembered him at all, it did so only as a brief disturbance, a pattern of footsteps that would fade with the next rain. Weeks passed before the full shape of what he had started became visible. From the outside, it looked like accountability. Press releases spoke of oversight failures, of corrective measures, of renewed commitments to transparency. Task forces were formed, budgets were reallocated. The language was careful, precise, engineered to reassure rather than to confess. Lawsuits followed, quietly at first, then with increasing frequency as documents surfaced and timelines were reconstructed. The forest became a case study, its damage quantified in charts and projections. He followed it all from a distance, reading reports the way one reads about a place they once lived, familiar enough to recognize the streets, distant enough to feel detached from the outcome. His name appeared occasionally, referenced in footnotes and testimonies, stripped of context, reduced to a function rather than a person. That too was expected. Systems did not preserve nuance unless it served a purpose. What unsettled him more were the parts that did not make the news. The remediation efforts focused on the most visible sites, the ones easiest to access, the ones already documented. Barriers were erected, soil was removed, treated, replaced. Monitoring stations dotted the landscape like quiet sentinels. From a distance it looked comprehensive. From up close it was selective. He knew better than to believe that everything had been found. The system he had uncovered had not been careless. It had been efficient. And efficiency, once threatened, did not simply vanish. It adapted. Some routes were abandoned, others rerouted. Some agreements dissolved, others resurfaced under new names. The forest would not be used the same way again, but the logic that had allowed it to be used at all still existed, intact and portable. That realization stayed with him as he settled into a quieter life, one not defined by patrol schedules or internal memos. He took work where he could find it, consulting occasionally, advising when asked, always careful to speak only to what he could prove. He was invited to panels, to closed-door discussions where the tone was earnest and the conclusions predetermined. He declined most of them. One afternoon, months after he had left, he returned to the edge of the park, stopping at a turnout where the trees pressed close to the road. He did not go inside, he did not need to. From there, he could see the canopy stretching outward, uninterrupted, deceptively whole. A visitor passing by would see only preservation, only wilderness reclaimed. He thought of the structures, now dismantled or buried beneath remediation layers. He thought of the countless small decisions that had built the system long before he ever noticed it. He thought of himself, years earlier, signing reports, redirecting routes, believing that harm was always loud enough to announce itself. The lesson was not that the system had been evil. That explanation was too simple, too comforting. The truth was harder. The system had been rational. It had weighed cost against consequence and chosen what it believed was manageable. The forest had been an acceptable loss not because no one cared, but because caring carried a price no one wanted to pay. That was the part that stayed with him most. In the months that followed, other cases surfaced in other places, each different in detail, identical in structure. Isolated zones, deferred responsibility, slow harm hidden behind complexity. He read about them quietly, recognizing the patterns, the language, the familiar logic. Sometimes he wondered how many more existed, undiscovered not because they were hidden well, but because no one was positioned to see them whole. He did not regret what he had done. Regret implied an alternative that felt cleaner, easier. There had been none. He had acted too late to prevent the damage and too early to stop all of it from continuing. That was the nature of such things. Exposure was not a cure. It was an interruption. On a cold evening near the end of the year, he received a message from someone he did not recognize. It was brief, careful, and unsigned. It thanked him, not for dismantling anything, but for making it visible. The sender did not claim victory or resolution. They acknowledged only that seeing the system had changed how they moved within their own. He read it twice, then closed the message without replying. Visibility, he had learned, was never an end state. It was a condition that required maintenance, attention, and willingness to look again after the first shock faded. The forest would recover unevenly. The system would survive, reshaped but familiar. The balance between them would shift, then settle, then shift again. As night fell, he stepped outside and listened. Somewhere far off, a bird called, answered by another. The sound carried clearly through the air, unremarkable and persistent. Life continued, not because it had been protected perfectly, but because it adapted. He stood there for a long time, breathing in the cold, aware that some parts of the wilderness were never meant to be reclaimed, only acknowledged. The truth he had uncovered did not resolve neatly, did not end with justice or restoration. It ended with awareness, with the understanding that harm could exist openly if everyone agreed not to name it. And now it had been named. The forest did not thank him. The system did not forgive him. But neither could pretend anymore that nothing had been there. If this story made you think, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Watch our other videos for more real stories that go deeper than they seem, and share this video with anyone who loves mysteries hidden in plain sight.